Welcome to Full Prefrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. Sorry if I'm repeating myself, but every time I welcome you back, I do like to define executive function. As you know, it's a key to personal success because the set of skills that we call executive function are a set of mental skills that go into managing our thoughts, our emotions, and in effect, managing our goals to produce actions that can help us achieve those goals and propel us towards progress. And in this process, we get to define who we are and who we become in the future. We get to kind of have a window into it. And of course, there's a problem. Sometimes we are either confused about the goals we should have for self. Sometimes we are unable to formulate a plan. And the worst is sometimes we are unable to stick to the plan we create. And all these habits of mind actually are the biggest reason why we create barriers for the success for the future self. And when I was younger or even in my work earlier on, I never thought too much about the future self or my own future self, let alone people that I worked with. But I have now come to understand the importance of formulating some type of outline, a silhouette, so to speak, of the future self, and keep feeding and nurturing that silhouette with flesh and bone and richness of imagination, so that the future self is well taken care of. And I hate to think that we take care of people when they're in trouble or they're suffering. But here's the future self. It's suffering from one ailment, and that's lack of attention from you. So I think with that in mind, it's a great pleasure to introduce my guest to you all. Her name is Eve-Marie Blouin-Hudon. She's a psychologist, and you have to forgive my pronunciation. It's French. It's always the most difficult language for me. Even though I speak 5 languages, nothing is useful when it comes to pronouncing French words. But she is an expert on imagination and well-being. Based on her research, she teaches courses at Carleton University on the psychology of creativity and innovation. She coaches at Impact Hub Ottawa and offers consulting to individuals and organizations through her business, Bevy Creative. And it's the coolest. You should, I'll be linking in our show notes. You should check it out. She's very fun and vibrant and has great ideas. And she's also the organizational health lead at Statistics Canada, where her team helps employees adapt to changes and experience great psychological health. Welcome, Ev. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for the great introduction and your very good pronunciation of my name.
You are very kind.
It was good.
And very forgiving. Very Canadian of you. Thank you, by the way. I don't mean to stereotype, but my older brother lives in Canada, and his children have grown up with Canadian mannerisms, and they're so distinctly lovely, which I really, really enjoy. So this podcast is about executive function, and that entails adaptive flexibility, goal assessment, intentional focus, and intentional attention to intentions, if I can say that 10 times. If you don't mind, maybe setting us off a little bit, I asked my guests to talk about their own executive function. As a child, how were you as a learner and a thinker? And did you give much thought to these processes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have now reflected back on what kind of learner I was as a child, because I do find myself quite privileged to have fit well within the existing school system here, like the public school system in Canada. And I was able to, I do have quite a flexible mind, and I'm able to absorb a lot of information at once. I'm able to visualize things well. And so if I'm doing or thinking of complex or abstract psychological constructs, for example, I'm able to almost visualize them in a 3D space. Same thing with statistics and numbers. I'm able to visualize things in a 3D space and to almost engage with them that way. They almost feel real. I was always like that as a child as well, very curious and intrinsically motivated for some things. And then when I was in elementary school, if something did not motivate me or I was not interested in it, then I would completely disconnect. So my grades as a kid were not that good. And I had to learn that sometimes giving a little bit more effort, or if I actually, consciously directed my attention to things that might not have been intrinsically motivating from the get-go, that I could build interest over time, or that I could see results over time. So I went maybe from a very serendipitous learner to a more focused learner over time.
And more intentional. I love that. And, I think one of the things that you said that speaks to me is this idea of, you said, I became intentional. I think we as children, or not, formal education doesn't nudge us to do these processes. It's my work, for example, in metacognition that has been built around that. But I only, because of the nature of my work with people when they are struggling. And now that my movement is by creating a digital curriculum and talking with schools and districts, one of my desires is that we should really teach these things. So we don't one day look back and say, "Ooh, yeah, I am this kind of learner." How about we focus on developing these skills right away? So as we dive deep into this, my first line of questions for you was going to be around the concept of the future self. You and I both are interested in the concept of this self and continuity of self through passage of time. And for effective executive functions to work, one must have a concept of self-regulation to produce better or different results for the self of another time. And the impact or the hold the current self has on one's own emotions is so hard to untangle that the future self has barely, I like to call, the future self has no lawyer representing in this court case. So can you talk a little bit about your interest in future self, and how do you conceptualize or talk us about the concept of continuity of self?
Sure. Yeah. This whole concept of future self is something that I came across through Dr. Tim Pitchell and Dr. Fusha Sirois, who's now at the University of Sheffield. And it really spoke to me in a way where the decisions that we make oftentimes are so grounded in the present moment, but we are in a way never grounded, or almost never grounded in the present moment in our stream of consciousness, where it seems like we're constantly thinking about the past or about the future. And the fact that we are making these decisions based on, like you said, our present emotions, and that we're forecasting these emotions on our future self, or forecasting what we feel now on our future self. And we know that, at least research has shown, that some of this affective forecasting is not correct. We falsely forecast some emotions to our future self. So it becomes very hard in the moment to be making a quote unquote objective decision about what are the best behaviors for us. And when you think about outcomes for future self, it's not that bad if you are making these false affective forecasts or decisions maybe that serve present self more every once in a while. But when it comes a consistent pattern, then you are likely to orient yourself towards a certain path over time than you are than you would be if you were making some future self-oriented decisions. And that happens because a lot of us actually can't really imagine the future self very well. And I thought that was really interesting.
That's so neat. And, I had the opportunity to interview Hal Hirschfield, whose work has influenced my thoughts
Yes,
about this. And
me as well.
you did too. And
Absolutely.
the digital curriculum, AI-based digital curriculum that I have created, one of the things off the bat I we do in the software is every child undergoes evaluation of their 7 areas of executive function. And based
Hmm.
on that assessment, they are given an opportunity to define or create a conceptual framework around the future self. So, in effort, they write a letter to the future self and they record a video addressing to the future self. And in that, there's a lot of elements of what things I'm willing to sacrifice for you, because I know when I behave
Hmm.
this way, you will be better. And there's an
Yeah.
element of bringing that back, so that this idea that my current self is not end all be all. So how have you studied this in your work, and how talk us a little bit about some of these stalling behaviors that we see, which is intentionally creating I don't want to say roadblocks, but having goals but not
Hmm.
actualizing them,
Hmm.
because the current hold the current self has, the emotional hold, it is willing to sabotage the outcomes for the future self, which we call procrastination. So
Absolutely.
how would you describe that, your work in that area?
Yeah, so my work was very much influenced initially actually by Hal Hirschfield's work as well, because he did a series of studies actually digitally aging people. And so that's what got me to think about, well, if you can do that through digital aging, or like what you're doing, I think is great, even connecting through making a video for future self and writing to future self. I think that it's great to use an external ager like this, but I was wondering, can we do this using our own imagination? What about our own capacity naturally to connect to future self? Do we have that to start with, or is that something that we need to constantly externally train in everyone, or is that different for certain people? Are people who are, and I don't want to label people procrastinators, so I'll just say people who tend to procrastinate more, were they
And do you
more
mind telling us
disconnected?
why you don't like to
Be,
label them?
sure, yeah, I think it becomes an identity thing when you're talking about this becoming metacognitive. Sometimes we are metacognitive about certain labels we have about we use them.
Yeah.
We use metacognition, maybe not in the most constructive way. I mean, identity is important, self-concept is important, but there's certain thing that when we label it, someone who procrastinate, it means that you can be someone who stops procrastinating as well. Instead of being a
Yeah.
procrastinator, just sounds very set in stone. Like it's like your personality, you can't overcome it.
I
So
really
that
like that,
that's
and I
why.
know you're about to describe the experiments, but I had Ethan Kross, the author of Chatter, and one of the things about the influence of that label is so vital, because that self-directed speech or inner speech has a great influence on your ability to take actions or stay inactive. But I
Absolutely.
love the way you are saying that we need to distinguish from I am not my thoughts, but I'm also not permanently this way.
That's it.
I have
That's it.
potential to
And
change.
that's it. And the label we use, when I write, and as a researcher, when I write research papers, or when I write for a lay audience, I make sure to be mindful of the words that I use and choose. Because in the past, I have used procrastinators, and I want to be careful with that. So, um,
Love that.
you know, I was really curious to know if people who tend to procrastinate more often felt more disconnected to future self, and if so, why? And so, in a series of studies, initially, what I did was, before doing the actual experiment, I was looking at people's innate ability to form mental images. So, I
Mm.
hypothesized that people who could, so we have different, all of us can create mental images, but using different senses. So, you might be better at sound. So, hearing music and sounds in your imagination, and someone else might be better at visualizing like an apple. If I'm saying imagine an apple, you might see it very, very clearly. You might see the details on the skin. You might see, even water dripping on the side. Other people are best at imagining smells and tastes, etc. And some people are good at all of them. And so I was wondering if you have greater ability in mental imagery and in the whole modality of mental images, then are you better able to connect to future self in a way that where you can really see this person clearly? You see them move, you see them talk, you see them, you hear them, you might smell them, and you realize that it's you. Or even if you don't realize that it's you, you at least realize that it's someone you love or someone you care about, and so you have empathy towards them. You feel, you were talking earlier about how maybe we'll help strangers if we're empathetic, but we don't help the self when we're procrastinating. And even in terms of strangers, we don't always help strangers because there's different types of empathy. And that's what I looked at with the experiment. I had participants listen to a mental imagery training about future self from different perspectives. So from a first person perspective, where they're actually in future self's shoes at the end of the semester, because this was for academic procrastination. At the end of the semester, they can see that they've procrastinated. They also can see another scenario where they haven't procrastinated. And then from a third person perspective, where they can see themselves from a bird's eye view, as if you were looking at another person. And what I found was that when participants imagined future self from that third person perspective, they felt a greater amount of this cognitive empathy instead of the affective or more emotional empathy. So cognitive empathy means that you can understand the situation that someone else is in, and in this case, that future self is in, but you're not necessarily flooded with the emotions, because if future self procrastinated, then it is likely that they're not in a super positive situation. In the case of academic procrastination, they might be feeling anxious, they might be feeling overwhelmed, stressed out with having to do last minute assignments, pulling all-nighters, and falling grades. And so that actually made people disengage from future self. Like it did not decrease procrastination over time in my study. And that actually mirrors the research on altruism with helping external strangers. When you feel affective, let's say I see someone and they fell and they hurt themselves really bad on the street, and I feel their pain and I feel their emotions, and suddenly I feel overwhelmed and scared, then I'm more likely to keep walking and not help them than if I feel a sense of sympathy or that cognitive empathy, that I can see they're in trouble, I can feel that they're in need, I can put myself in their shoes, in that it's not a positive situation to be in, and so I should intervene and help. So it seems as though this aspect of cognitive empathy, or being able to take a bird's eye view, even for future self, is more helpful for us to move us towards action and overcome procrastination.
I love that, and I think one of the striking thing about your research was, I think, the way you sliced it in a non-digitized way of altering, or rather, first of all, in Hal Hirschfield's work, one of the things that fascinated me is that path was not explored, but he actually showed the digitally altered pictures of somebody at 65, and that jarred people. So that vivid and relatively dilapidated self invokes this fear and empathy, or maybe cognitive or affective, but both. What was so neat about your work is you said, well, let's not even show you, because let's have you show some imagery of your changed self. And I think which again, to me, kind of takes into consideration that we have different ways of going about it, but the process is very similar, and you showed that it can have remarkable impact. So one question that occurred to me as I was reflecting on your work is My son visited Tanzania a couple of years ago, and he came back and he was sharing with me this, um, you know, African proverb. It went something like this: that indecision is like a stepchild. If it does not wash hands, it's called dirty. If he does, he's wasting water. So I think I was wondering, what is the relationship between indecision versus procrastination? Because both
Oof.
look at the surface very similar because it's inaction. Do you
Mm-hmm.
have any insight into that?
That's a great question, and here I will speak about my own perception of what the differences are, not having done like a proper literature review on the differences
Of
between the
course.
concept. But no, that's a great question. I mean, procrastination and indecision is definitely part of procrastination, or it can live in procrastination, but not always. So indecision does not define procrastination, because you can still, I feel like with indecision is that you have many choices, many avenues of going about an action. You might not know which way to go or which way to choose. But with procrastination, you could have a very clear path. Everything could be laid out. This is what you need to do. This is when you need to do it. This is the deadline, and still not act. So in procrastination, there's that added layer of everything can be laid out in front of you. You could have everything ready. You could have, let's say you're writing a book, you could have your word processor right in front of you. You could have your candle lit, your music, your perfect space, and still you could just sit there and decide not to do it. Now there's some research, a lot of research trying to explore why that is. Is it fear of failure for some? Possibly. Is it that in the moment you want to do mood repair? So instead of doing a task that might be perceived as tedious or difficult, you want to feel good, and so instead I'll watch TV, or I'll go for a walk, or a lot of people clean. So for some reason, when they procrastinate, they clean. So do you want to feel like you're still advancing something that's good and necessary, and good for your overall task? You can check that off the list. So there's a lot behind procrastination that could be causing it. And with indecision, I mean, you could be indecisive and still be acting somehow, still make a choice eventually. And so that's where I'd say the difference is here. Procrastination is bigger than just indecision.
I love that. The reason I asked you that, because, if you look at the literature and many people's work that you're familiar with, the effects of procrastination, to me, and effects of indecision look alike, which is low productivity, general anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
lowered mood,
Mm-hmm.
overall sense of lack of sense of well-being. And so
Mm-hmm.
indecision, though, to me, as you also distinguish there, feels like actually not having adequate knowledge about the planning process,
Mm-hmm.
or not having a
Yeah,
good sense of how to organize the task,
that's
um,
it.
right? And not
Yeah,
having the task management skills. But the
that's it.
um, procrastination is having done the cognitive part. Now it's the affective mismanagement, like you said,
That's it.
right?
That's it. And Tim Pitchell has said that a lot. Procrastination is not solved by better time management. You could have great
Yes,
time management and still procrastinate.
yes. And so it's all like all procrastination is pain management. So,
Mm-hmm.
right, that's how I see
Mm-hmm.
it, actually. And
Yeah.
so kind of teaching people, which is so interesting to me, if we can indulge here for one more second, is the cost of procrastination is so high, and people are enduring these outcomes which are unfavorable, but they're
Mm.
literally doing everything in their capacity to avoid the experience of pain, whatever the pain feels
Mm-hmm.
like. So one of the
Mm-hmm.
things taxes invokes this incredible dread that, oh my God, I have to go through these numbers and
Yeah.
scattered receipts, right?
Yeah. I'm
So
sure there's a lot of tax procrastination.
tax procrastination. Yeah. I mean, I was just laughing last year when during the pandemic they extended the deadline. I'm like, that's the worst thing government did.
Yeah, for sure.
It's like
People are just gonna wait till the last minute anyways.
it has professionally extended the misery. I certify you to be more miserable for 2 more months. So as you think about sharing with us, how did you then um, get into the work of imagination, and what are your recent projects about? And sounds like this imagination thought experiment has really propelled you to go in that direction.
Absolutely, absolutely. I started my whole academic journey initially wanting to study motivation, and so procrastination for me was, it is a motivation or a lack of motivation somehow, right? It falls within that realm for me, and so um, having done this research and just it sparked for me this whole, it opened up more this whole literature and world on imagination, reading up on mental imagery, our ability to create inner worlds, and then it really got me into this whole literature on mind wandering and daydreaming. And I always approach my research with a well-being lens, so that's always the outcome that I look at. I really, at the end of the day, I want my research to be able to help people, and to help people thrive and grow, not just get by. um, so for me, I was looking at how, okay, daydreaming in the literature, it seems as though it's being often compared to something that's negative for you. Like people who are mind wandering a lot are ruminating, and they're stuck in the past, and they would rather shock themselves than sit with 15 minutes with their own mind. And I was wondering if, with every psychological construct, it's not black and white. There's a lot of gray area depending on who you are, depending on where you are, depending on your psychology. And so it really motivated me to then start studying how our spontaneous thoughts, how our stream of consciousness actually could influence our concept of self, how we see ourselves, and then other things like creativity, like well-being. So that's what I did my PhD on. I really studied how daydreams can influence our sense of self, depending on whether your daydreams are in a more narrative and story-like form, and whether you're having daydreams that are more spontaneous, associative in nature, so just a little bit more disconnected, which we have, all the time. I have a song, and then suddenly I'm thinking about eggs, and suddenly I'm thinking about, this, and that, and how this spontaneous imagination might relate in a way to our well-being. So, is it good sometimes? When is it good? Is it bad sometimes? When is it bad? And this then opened a whole literature to me on creative thinking, and I developed some workshops around that with Dr. Janet Mantler at Carleton University, she's an organizational psychologist, and so that was kind of an aside passion and interest of mine, but I think all interconnected, and eventually what sparked my my desire to take this research and to distill it in a way that's very practical and useful for people to engage with. So then I designed a course on creativity and play, this whole idea of playfulness, because I did find in my research that we do have a variety of daydreams. Our imagination, if left untamed, if left without any metacognition or self-awareness, sometimes can take us in different directions that are not always good for us. Or it has so much potential, but we need to have that self-awareness. We need to have that metacognition in order to understand our imagination, in order to use it as a tool for well-being, as a tool for creativity, as a tool for productivity in a way as well. And so it really became a big passion of mine to try and distill this down to very practical tools for people to use in their everyday lives, to use in the workplace, or to use for their own well-being and growth. And so that's how that journey evolved. I'm not one step at a time, but I'm really happy with where it led me.
No, I love that journey. I had a wonderful another Canadian researcher, Dr. James Dankert. If you're familiar with his work on boredom, and as I was preparing for that talk, it just occurred, like I came across this whole incredible the nature of boredom, which can't tell you what you ought to do, and
Mm-hmm.
they both the author said neither can we. So it is this limbo state where whatever you're doing right now is not engaging your attention, but whatever the choices
Mm-hmm.
you have don't seem to be propelling you towards that. But the mind wandering states, on the other hand, is bedrock for creativity and um,
That's it.
just roping yourself back to be productive is where the rub is. um,
Yeah, and we'll daydream. Daydream is usually sparked or activated when we are bored because the external stimuli, the stimulation in the external
it's not
environment, is
stimulating
not
enough.
engaging enough. And so what we do in this case is our mind naturally, that is called a default mode network, is the areas of our brain that activate, and they bring us into our inner world. So boredom is kind of necessary for that to happen.
It's so interesting in their book, and later on I kind of looked up at during the World War II, a a Canadian enlisted soldier, I think Sidney Gunter was his name. He would doodle, but he had good drawing skills. And there was a picture he drew of himself smoking a little cigarette, and the bullets are flying. He's getting bored in the middle of a war.
That's hilarious. Wow, that's
And he's
very
like, oh
neat.
my God, this is so boring. And I think that to me captures this whole notion of the most dangerous and actionful life is still not adequate for that mind to say, okay, I'm going to go inside and just I'm going to daydream now.
Oh yeah, that's true. You can habituate to a lot.
Yes, I mean, talk about habituation, exactly.
Yeah.
So as you talk about this connection between capacity to let the mind wander and take it on a path, a structureless path of exploration, how do you see two things people can balance? And particularly, I see this in education. Children are really bored. And I
Mm-hmm.
primarily feel a couple of reasons, because there's so much. When a teacher is responsible for 20 kids at a time, she definitely has to do attention management. She has to
For
force and
sure.
impose, so compliance becomes the focus. And one of the ways to
Mm.
comply is to say nothing, move, and not move.
Mm.
Because if you have a
It
curiosity
is.
question, or if you have a thought, that is considered an interruption. So,
Mm-hmm.
and if you see really a child daydreaming, it's considered disrespectful. So there's
Mm-hmm.
so much just, cultural heavy-handedness of
Yeah.
expecting engagement by being still,
Yeah.
non-speaking, and cooperating by doing, when you may not be invested in the and you can become motionless as you're engaged. So how can we kind of pull kids out of that and allow this mind wandering in a effective way, and yet not make them these rogue kids who are not being cooperative?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll steal this from you. Is teaching kids about these metacognitive concepts. Teaching them. I think it's such a fantastic idea to teach kids about their own minds, so that they know. Oh, when I'm listening to the teacher, and then suddenly I can't hear her voice, and I'm imagining a different scene. Maybe I'm imagining playing with my dog or with my friends. That's daydreaming. And I think making purposeful time for daydreaming, it could be quiet time. And for some, like you mentioned, doodling, a lot of people like to doodle when they daydream. Some people
Yes.
like to do that. Some people like to maybe have some other sensory
Fidget.
stimulation, fidget toys, or silly putty, Play-Doh, Lego blocks. Often making a puzzle. When you're making a puzzle, we're often just daydreaming, doing something that's still engaging us, but so we're not fully bored, but we're
Fully
what
bored.
we're
Yes.
doing. We're not fully bored, but what we're doing is simple enough or repetitive enough that we can let our mind wander. And then capturing that, because I think it's always interesting for self-discovery to be able to capture what is going on in our mind. And so there's this whole idea of free writing that I teach to everybody I meet. I teach to my students, and I think you could definitely teach it to kids. This idea of free writing is you have a prompt, and you could have, maybe a mind wandering or a quiet time session, and then after this session, to close it off, you could ask the kids to say, what did you experience? What did you think about? What went on through your mind? And then you set a timer. I wouldn't say 5 minutes for a kid, but you can move all the way up to that. But for a child, it could be 2 minutes. Set a timer for 2 minutes. And for that time, the pencil doesn't leave the page. And if you have a writing block, you just say that. You just write that you have a writing block and that you
Oh, I
don't know
love
what to
that.
say. So this whole idea of free writing, it was developed by Peter Elbow, I believe back in the 80s. And it's fantastic. It just connects us back to our stream of consciousness, because it's really, that's what you're doing. You're putting your stream of consciousness out onto the page. It doesn't matter if you don't follow the prompt, but you might have these aha moments. You might have these metacognitive realizations about yourself. You might become a little bit more self-aware about what's going on when you daydream. And so if there's something valuable there, for either a lesson about the self or a creative idea, then you've captured it in that session. So it's about making daydreaming more purposeful. I don't think that doing that would stop kids from daydreaming in other contexts, of course. But at least there's a purposeful time for it. And I think when you, again, this whole idea of play and creating a play space is that you create maybe a behavior that's frowned upon, and you make it something playful and fun and useful. And kids also, at a very young age, when they're more in I forget the word in English for this one, but in kindergarten, when they're in kindergarten, they actually externalize daydreaming a lot. And so they do daydream to a certain extent, but their sense of self is not that developed. So their stream of consciousness is not as organized as ours, if you could say that. Sometimes yours might not feel so organized, but they actually externalize daydreaming, they externalize play. And so if you notice very, very young kids, they'll just blurt out what they're thinking, or they'll blurt out, suddenly they're this character, suddenly they sing a song, and it just comes out of their mind. And eventually, over time, we start to internalize that chatter, and it becomes a big part of our mind wandering and of our daydreams. So I think just understanding for kids that playtime and daydreaming, or verbalizing the stream of consciousness, they kind of go hand in hand. And so leaving room for that is really important as well, and letting them express that is important.
I love that. And I think that so beautifully ties with well-being, because well-being is also working out some unresolved issues, or having the capacity to unburden the working memory, to not impose structure, but kind of see how, the classic, what the apple falling on Newton's head. That was not the first time he had thought about it, and it may be a folklore, but I think this idea clicking can happen if we have the room to let the ideas float around freely, right?
Absolutely. And that you're not trying to suppress them. You're looking at them, right? You're leaving room for you to look at. And this is not looking at the future self with a third eye perspective. It's almost like looking at the present self through a bird's eye view, through that third eye perspective. So looking at ourselves, it's funny that our consciousness is very complex. We can look at future self, we can look at past self, and we could look at ourselves in the present moment. And they're all very valuable states to be in, because we are not just beings. We're not just reactive. We can be more than just reactive. We can be self-aware
and respond rather than react.
That's it.
As we come to a close, how do you think the mindfulness literature, which shows such remarkable impact on well-being, which is very it's complementary to the mind wandering process, but there is a
Mm-hmm.
non-judgmental witnessing. That means not
Mm-hmm.
interfering and also not having an agenda. Sometimes I think when people are in the imaginative state, they kind of are bedazzled by their brilliance and they want to act on it or translate that into something. Ooh, that's a great idea. Let me find a piece of paper to write it. Oh, that was a great quote.
Mm-hmm.
I can see people tripping over themselves, trying to become suddenly productive in the middle of their mind wandering state. Or
Yeah.
sometimes people are really critical when they're ruminating and revisiting the same
Yeah.
thought. So, all the mindfulness and loving compassion practices are talking about presencing or witnessing. How do you
Mm-hmm.
see the continuum of imagination and creativity in that way where you don't interfere with it?
Yeah, I think you put it very well. And that's something that I grappled with a lot when I was first coming to daydreaming and studying it. Was that how does it differ from just sitting with in a mindful way or meditating? And I know there's many different schools of thought on meditation. There's different ways to meditate. And the love and compassion meditations are a big one, and the non-judgmental one is a big one as well. And I like this when you said you sometimes when we almost get this burst of like dopamine when we have a great idea and suddenly we're tripping everywhere and it's just kind of chaotic, or we want to do something with it, but it's kind of this big burst of energy that we might not know how to bring back into a purposeful and clear way forward and action. And so there has to be room. There's a lot we have to do to train our minds and to familiarize ourselves with our minds. And I think having a mindfulness practice, having a meditation practice is really important. And that meditation practice is not necessarily is not a space where you should engage with creative thought. You should just observe them. You should just
Yes.
observe thought and know that when you're in this space, like I think carving out intentional space for everything is really important for us. So if you carve out this intentional meditative space, this is where you are a non-active observer. And then
I
when you
love
carve
that.
out a space for play, for playfulness and for creativity, this is a space where you can spread all the blocks out onto the floor and have fun and have that burst of dopamine and have that unbridled energy. And then when you come into a space of calmness later on, you are allowing whatever came up for you during a very playful, high energy space and situation, you're allowing it to consolidate. You're allowing your ideas to come together, because in creativity, there's divergence, but you also have to bring it all back. And so you have to go big, and that can seem chaotic sometimes, or it can seem confusing. Like, how do I make this into a tangible, real thing? Well,
I
you
love
you
that.
you you allow yourself to just bring it back down, and you allow your mind and you allow yourself time. So procrastination, when you procrastinate, what you don't allow yourself is time to percolate ideas, time to get into many different iterations of these different spaces. um, when you
And
do
time
things ahead
to,
of time. Oh, go
and
ahead.
sorry, and I was going to say the time,
Yeah.
very important thing you mentioned, which is time to allow this wave of discomfort to pass.
Yeah.
I think that's where the real rubber meets the road. I think people in the state of
Mm,
procrastination are so incredibly afraid to feel the feelings, they substitute it. If you just wait
mm,
it, it's just like a hunger
yeah.
pang, you know? You don't need to eat
Yeah.
immediately, you just let the wave go by. Sorry, I didn't
Yeah,
mean to interrupt you.
absolutely. No, that was great. That was great. And you could train that with a meditation practice. That's something that you could train to, like you said, not to be so reactive, but to be responsive and to know that's it. And there's a space to be reactive. There's a space to be an observer. And it's not always, it might seem overwhelming to and suddenly I have to have all these spaces, and how do I set this up? And I call it a creative hygiene. You just
I love that.
create new little habits over time. It's like flossing your teeth. You do it every day, and you trust the process. You trust that it's a process, and that in the process there's many different little blocks and little spaces that you need to enter to be able to bring. Let's say you have a goal of bringing you want to write a book, or you want to write a play, or you want to create a piece of art, or whatever it might be. That will take time. You will have to cycle through this process many times, and making a hygiene of it, of that creative process, is super important. And it becomes your friend, and then it just becomes a natural way of being, even if it's uncomfortable.
I love that. I think I practice creative hygiene more than I do my dental flossing. So there's something learning to be done. It's so interesting. I recently came across a phrase called atmospheric rivers, and Jenny Odell is she's a beautiful writer and an author and a remarkable young person, and she talks about this. This is my new favorite book. Um, that How to Do Nothing. If you are interested, you should look that up.
I am.
She talks about this on her desk. She has a jar of rainwater. She's a Filipino, half Filipino, and she says, when I learned the concept about atmospheric rivers, these are clouds that travel long distances and they bring rain. The rain is not formulated there. So she lives in San Francisco, and she said, when it rains, it reminds me they actually have come from Philippines. And so the jar of water just triggers my thoughts about these incredible ways we are connected. And so in my creative deck, I collect things. And that was one of the things that I just was so awestruck. One of the emotions I'm cultivating as a way to bring balance is awe. And I'm just like, you're my fifth person I have told this concept since yesterday because I love it so much.
Awe is very powerful.
Yeah. So thank you. As we end our conversation, I would love to know what influences your beautiful mind, and how do you shape your thoughts, and do you have any recommendations for our listeners as to how they can indulge in the same pursuits as you have?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, a big influence for me is the people around me, is my community. I would say I'm definitely more introverted, but I've always enjoyed time by myself, but always after I've engaged with different people, learned from them, put myself in different situations, learn from just various perspectives. And so for me, if I didn't have that, I don't think I would have half the ideas or the inspirations that I've been blessed to have. So number one is people, finding people that have all sorts of perspectives. They don't have to think like me. I actually seek people that are very different than me, because I learn the most from them. Yeah, and it's I don't care to have uncomfortable conversations. I'll have them. So number one is that, and then number two is just making time to be out in nature. For me, that's huge. I love to garden. I love to walk and bike and go on runs on nature trails. And ever since I was little, I've always loved animals and discovering the natural world. So for me, the cloud story that you just said resonates a lot with me, because I feel, and this whole idea of awe, I feel awe so often when I'm in nature. I feel small and I feel connected to everything. And we can see that the natural systems that are out there are so crucial for our survival, and that our survival and the way we take care of the earth is so crucial for these systems. And so just seeing that interconnectedness is awe-inspiring. So that's a big one for me as well. So If I was to suggest anything to readers is, keep meeting new people, get out into the natural world, spend time in nature, and read all sorts of books, because that's like meeting new people in a certain way, is to see these different perspectives and different ways of life. Sometimes some stories we would never have even thought existed until we read a book about it, about a personal story. Yeah. So those are my big ones.
Well, thank you for this absolutely fabulous conversation. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. If you love what you hear, please share. Please subscribe to our newsletter. Please leave us a review. Feel free to reach out to me. My email is sucheta@exqinfiniteknowhow.com. And thanks again, Ev, for being here with us, and your time and your expertise. We really benefited from it.
Thank you so much, Sucheta. And thank you for putting this together and for your wonderful questions. It's talking about these things really gives me a lot of energy. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full Prefrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.